On tonight's edition of the CHGO Cubs Related podcast, the GM meetings are wrapping up. Deadlines are approaching and the offseason is about to kick into high gear. What does Jed Hoyer have in store for the 2026 Chicago Cubs? All that and more on tonight's edition of the CHGO Cubs Related podcast. This is the CHGO Cubs Related podcast driven by Toyota. Let's go places. My name is Corey. I am joined this week by none other than Jared Willis, the wonderful writer at ALLCITY.com for all things baseball, but certainly the Chicago Cubs. We are coming to you on Thursday. It is November 13th. And Jared, I feel like we're in that last slow spot of the offseason. We're waiting for the qualifying offer decisions, some non-tender decisions, and, a couple weeks, right, from the winter meetings, and then things will really start to ratchet up. So that last maybe quiet period before real action.
Yeah, I always feel like when you get the awards announcements, that's sort of your last opportunity to just take it easy. I know we have GM meetings going on, but that's always just a lot of like Scott Boras quotes about stuff, and nothing's really happening. And so, yeah, this is the last little quiet spell before things will pick up and pick up pretty soon. Because I think, not just for the Cubs, but it's going to be an interesting offseason on the whole. With some of the uncertainty about the next CBA and where things are going to go. And so one of the things I'll be curious about just in general is how all teams approach this offseason. But of course, especially the Cubs coming off of what I would argue is a successful year, ended with some disappointment, but a good season on the whole and a good step forward. So let's see what comes next this offseason about making steps forward in 2026.
Absolutely. We've already heard, kind of rumblings and a lot of people asking the question, like, how are teams going to approach a potential CBA issue, a potential lockout? Do they opt for shorter term deals? Do the players try to seek that out? Obviously, we don't have that answer yet, but that will unfold in the next few weeks and months. Tuesday, I believe in the evening, we have those qualifying offer decisions. Certainly relevant to the Cubs is the Shota Imanaga decision. Jed was at the GM meetings and, really, I don't think tipped his hand too much other than to say it's not a foregone conclusion that Shota will not be back, just that the club option didn't work for them and the player option didn't work for Shota. Maybe they meet somewhere in the middle. Maybe he picks up that option. We'll see. But, I think he literally said, I don't want to throw cold water on the thing. So we'll see how that goes. If you're interested in kind of a breakdown from our viewers here of kind of what went on with Shota mechanically and with his stuff after he came back from injury, Brendan did a really nice breakdown of that last week on our show last Thursday. If you want to dig into that. But Jared, I know it's been a while since the playoffs, you were telling me, since you've been on these airwaves. I'm curious if you have a strong feeling one direction or another. Like, I know you're a journalist first and foremost, but even just as someone, watching this team, rooting for this team, are you hoping Shota takes that offer? Are you hoping he opts out and the Cubs spend that money elsewhere? What's kind of your gut feeling on Shota as that decision looms 4 days away?
Yeah. So I would say what I'm hoping for and my gut feeling are two different things. So I'll start with what I'm hoping for. So what I'm hoping for is that he does take the qualifying offer, because I'm a big believer in the Cubs pitching coaching staff and what that group is able to do, especially when you can identify an issue, when you're able to point to here's some of what was causing, like we saw the home run problems, and those were rearing their ugly head long before the playoffs started. So I'd like to see him do that, because I think that there's easily some adjustments that can be made, and we have seen what Shota Imanaga is capable of when he is his best self. And the possibilities for a rotation with Justin Steele coming back at some point, you don't want to just slot him right in, from the get-go, but Justin Steele coming back at some point, if Imanaga is still there, Cade Horton really emerging as this potential, star starting pitcher, I just feel comfortable with the idea of trusting Imanaga and the Cubs pitching organization to be able to address what's going on with him, so that we can see more like the Shota that we got used to for a year and a half or so.
Sure.
So I'd like to see that happen. That said, I do think my gut feeling tells me that he's not going to take the qualifying offer. I think what we're going to see happen is he's just, given his age, I think that's part of the reason why that he's not going to take it, because for him, he's really has like maybe one shot at trying to get something that's a little more long-term for a little more money. And if the Cubs feel like they can fix what went wrong with him, there's at least half a dozen other organizations that think the same thing, that would love the chance to bring him on board and get the Shota Imanaga that the Cubs had in 2024 and for a chunk of 2025. So for that reason, I don't think it's going to happen. I think he knows that. And so he's not going to take this qualifying offer. He's probably going to get a pretty good contract from somewhere. I'm not going to even try to predict that at this point, but so that's my gut feeling. But I would love to go on record as saying I'd like to see him take that qualifying offer, because I want him in that Cubs rotation next year.
Yeah, and look, I mean, ultimately, if the Cubs, Brendan and I talked about this last week, like if the Cubs extend this offer, certainly they wouldn't mind getting that pick back if he declines it. But also, if you're going to put it out there, you must have some confidence that he's going to be worth that 1-year deal, or you can figure it out, because otherwise you don't want to be on the hook for it, or you better be sure he's going to turn it down. So it would imply that it's one of those two things. They're sure he's going to turn it down, or they have some confidence that they understand what was going on, he can rehab over this offseason, and that he can still be a valuable contributor to this rotation, even if it is not in that top of the rotation way. Again, as we kind of continue to talk about ad nauseum here, like you need the depth. You'll take the depth. Mm-hmm. You're going to use it. And sometimes you find yourselves in the playoffs debating whether Colin Ray should get the ball, in a decisive game. So your best laid plan doesn't always come to fruition. But outline, sort of for the rest of the show, I think is kind of just to talk about this offseason and some of the conversations that are going on. I do see our YouTube chat like giving 2051, bringing up a lot of names that we're already kind of hearing. Talk about Dylan Cease, Mackenzie Gore. I know Mackenzie Gore is a guy that Lance over at the Marquee Network was tweeting the other day. He'd be really intrigued for the Cubs to take a flyer on. Framber Valdez, another guy who is available. And we did, we talked earlier, Jared, like debating giving the mic to our wonderful producer, Sean Anderson, just kind of letting him riff for the next 45 minutes on Dylan Cease. We decided against it, but Sean was, unavailable. He's got to save his voice, but we did think about that. So there he is. Wait a minute.
I mean, why not? If anybody's got more insights into Dylan Cease over the last few years, how about somebody that's watched him really closely for a while, watched him develop into the guy that became, worth a trade to San Diego, and then maybe a reunifying in the North Side. Sean, what say you?
If you want somebody to make 32 starts every single season, there's no better pitcher than Dylan Cease. I'll get out.
I mean, hey, look, and like that is something the Cubs need. We've talked about that. You have a lot of guys. I don't want to belabor that. I feel like we, especially Brendan and I have talked about it a lot. But like, you have a lot of guys that just haven't done that. at the major league level. They have not gone, I always say, pole to pole and, been there deep in the playoffs too. And that's not a knock on those guys. It's not a knock on Justin Steele that he's gotten hurt, but you can't confidently say, obviously he's not going to start, in March or, early April, whenever this season begins. But you can't confidently say he is going to make 32 starts and he is going to be at his best self come the NLCS, just because he hasn't done it. You just haven't seen it. Same with a guy like Cade Horton, Shota in that same boat as well. Matthew Boyd has experience pitching in the playoffs and was great for the Cubs this year, but showed some kind of wear and tear as the year was going on. So, durability in guys is not necessarily something that you would be afraid of with the Cubs. Now, there's all kinds of considerations. Dylan Cease does have a qualifying offer attached to him. Talking about Framber Valdez, I'm curious, Jared, like on that one, like obviously a great pitcher. I believe a guy that the Cubs were looking at the trade deadline a few years ago related to Wilson Contreras. But I do sort of share the concern in our YouTube chat, the whole cross-up thing that happened last year and like what that would mean for the clubhouse. We're going to talk about all these guys and like dig into this, but since it was brought up, like I'm curious, as someone who's been in that clubhouse, like how much weight do you give something like that? Obviously you're not in Houston, so it's hard for you to know exactly Framber, what that situation was like. But even just reading the rumors and as fans, we kind of talk about that stuff. Like, what's your reaction to potentially bringing someone like that in? How much weight you give that? And I think in particular, like having been in that Cubs clubhouse, it does feel like, and this goes back to Theo, with a few notable exceptions, obviously, like this team has done a pretty good job of, I think, carefully curating their clubhouse culture over the years.
Yes, and they absolutely have. That's been something that has really been true now for quite some time, because you're right. That does go back to Theo, and that's something that Jed has continued with, that as one of the factors that I think that they're mindful of when they're looking at a player, whether it's somebody they're going to sign or somebody they're going to trade for, is looking at that personality and looking at how they're going to gel with the rest of the group. Because there is, when I go into that locker room, there you can sense when there's divisions. You can kind of pick up on when there's issues like that, or when there's some tension in the air, that kind of stuff, because I've been in other locker rooms where that was the case, and you can feel it. So I can say that, like, consistently when the Cubs have been not so good up to this season, the one thing that has stayed true is they are mindful of the personalities in the clubhouse, because that does matter. That does, that is a factor. There's a reason why guys like Matt Boyd work so well for the Cubs, or Nico Horner or Dansby Swanson and some of these guys. And so you do have to at least consider that with somebody like Valdez, where, do you want to write him off based on what appears to be maybe an isolated incident? I don't think so, but I think you at least have to give that some consideration. And that is one thing that I trust the Cubs front office to do, because they've shown that they are good at that. I mean, they, year after year, again, even in seasons where they haven't been great, that is something that they've done well with, is maintaining a clubhouse culture that feels consistent from year to year, regardless of who comes and goes. With some maybe minor exceptions here and there. I mean, I know it's been talked about, but Justin Turner, I've never heard anyone talked about the way that Justin Turner was.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
If you look at just the bare bones of the numbers that he put up, it's like, okay, well, what did he really do for you? But talking to guys behind the scenes, that it's major. I mean, I had a story I was working on Justin Turner, had the Cubs advance to the NLCS, and I got these quotes from PCA that, were incredible, and I was bummed I couldn't use them. But I'll tell you really quickly, Pete Crow Armstrong said, when Turner walked in spring training, he said he felt a difference in the whole clubhouse. And so all that to say, there's something about how the Cubs approach guys like this that is a factor. It's clearly something they prioritize. So when you're talking about pitchers that they're looking at, or any player, they're not going to glaze over something like that.
Yeah, and I think with Valdez, it's an interesting thing because it's like it's not we at least on the surface we don't have like this. It's not a list of crimes that he's committed. It's a pretty popular incident that it certainly doesn't reflect well, right? It's not. I didn't like it, and I'm not even an Astros fan. I was like, well, I don't like that at all. But like when you started, yeah, my mind immediately went to Turner. Like this organization wants those types of things where a guy in the clubhouse is completely, mentoring and really shaping a young player like Turner did with PCA, not the opposite end of that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But it is hard to know how much weight to put in that. And I think you're right. You kind of just have, if the Cubs decide to make that move, you have to trust that they do their due diligence. Obviously, they've had several Astros here recently. You got to trust that they would check that out. And if they made the move, they would believe it wouldn't be something that would harm them, obviously. So let's hit our first ad break here. We'll be back in a bit to continue talking about this Cubs offseason and what Jed Hoyer might have in store for us. Hey, Cubs fans, Toyota has 25 vehicles with available all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive. The RAV4 has legendary versatility. The Grand Highlander's adult-sized third row is for real, and the Tacoma's wild side comes standard. From job sites to campsites and game nights, there's an all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive Toyota to get you there in style. Find yours at toyota.com or visit your Chicagoland Toyota dealer. Toyota, let's go places. And as always, we invite you to become a CHGO diehard and upgrade your fandom today. You get access to our exclusive written content, a free t-shirt, plenty of discounts on future merch and events, plus access to our CHGO Discord lounge where we all hang out and talk Chicago sports and so much more. Go to allchgo.com for the latest information on how you can join the thousands of CHGO diehards in our community. We can't wait to connect with you on an ever greater level.
Jared.
Corey, winter is going to be here before you know it. Is your home's heating ready for that challenge? I know it's going to be warm this weekend, but we've got winter weather coming soon. If you have a plumbing emergency, call Four Seasons. An electrical emergency, call Four Seasons. If you need a new hot water tank installed today, call Four Seasons. Now is the time to schedule your Four Seasons furnace tune-up. Thinking about a whole home generator? We've got you covered. At Four Seasons, we guarantee same-day installation for all your heating, cooling, plumbing, electrical, and generator needs with no extra charge for nights, weekends, or holidays. You can save up to $4,000 on furnaces and comfort systems with Four Seasons heating, air conditioning, plumbing, and electric. Furnaces start at $39 a month, and furnace AC combos from $57 a month. Call today and save $50 from your trusted local experts. Four Seasons Heating, Air Conditioning, Plumbing, and Electric has been serving Chicagoland for over 50 years. They're your trusted local experts are Four Seasons Heating, Air Conditioning, Plumbing, and Electric. Visit fourseasonsheatingcooling.com for all their special offers and money-saving coupons. That's fourseasonsheatingcooling.com.
All right, folks, we're back talking Chicago Cubs off-season plans. Let's talk Dylan Cease. I know that was a name that came up, and I think maybe as we continue, it's a lot of pitchers. I think I do want to ask you kind of gut check because Brendan and I have kind of offered our thoughts on this. Like we're not going to delve into the let's spend 30 minutes yelling about how much money they spend and all that other stuff. I give this caveat every time. You guys know how I feel about that. You know how Brendan feels about that. I'm sure Jared has expressed his opinion on that many times. I want them to spend $1 billion. They're not going to, so here we are. But I have seen some discussion of should they prioritize offense and replacing Kyle Tucker or bringing Kyle Tucker back? Should they let some of the kids play and prioritize pitching and really spend money there? Should they use some of the kids to trade for pitching and upgrade that way? If you were in Jed's shoes, and especially, having been there the night, as the Cubs get eliminated, and watching this team in the playoffs, how would you approach this offseason in a rational sense? Like, what would your priority be? Who would you be looking at? And what would you kind of in a broad sense look at and say, hey, this was a successful offseason if they knock out these priorities?
Yeah, because in my mind, that's going to mean sort of going a different direction from what so much of the talk has been so far this offseason, because so much of the talk has been about pitching, which I get. I completely understand that emphasis, because there's the old adage, you can't have too much pitching, all of that. But in my mind, I think the way that they need to approach this offseason is, you took a big step forward in 2025. You got 9 more wins during the regular season. It was good enough to get you the top wild card spots. You were hosting that series. And maybe in a year where the Brewers don't have just these unreal winning streaks, you're also maybe a division winner, and your playoffs look quite a bit different. But the important thing is you did take this very significant step forward. And so what would be a waste in my mind is to not then do everything you can to make another step forward. Because the next goal now has to be, how do we win this division? Or how do we win more than 92 games in 2026? Because to just kind of fill in spots and work around the periphery and some of that just isn't going to cut it. And one of the areas where I think they badly need to focus on is they have to have a power bat in that lineup. They have to have somebody who's consistently providing power, obviously, ideally from the left side of the plate, but those guys can feel like unicorns sometimes. And so I do think that they should be making their every effort to bring Kyle Tucker back. I know his performance this season left something to be desired. A lot of that was injury related. The second half, it felt like he faltered and all that, but we know what was going on with him. Given what we know he's capable of, given his age, I think that's an area of focus that they just have to have, because he can give you something on offense that this team badly needs. And not only that, for as excited as we are, and understandably so, about guys like Owen Casey, in order to take a step forward in 2026, I don't think that giving young players the majority of the starts in right field or wherever in the outfield, I don't think that's the right decision to make. Does that mean trading them for pitching? I don't think that's necessarily what you have to do, but I don't think that I want to see Owen Casey playing 120 games for the Cubs in next season. I just don't think that's the recipe for them. And it's nothing to do with Owen Casey. It's simply because he's a young, inexperienced player. So that's not a knock on him at all. It's just where this team is. I want to see them take another step forward. And in my mind, it's put an emphasis on offense and power in the lineup, because you have guys that can get on base. You have good base runners. You need guys that can just knock the ball over the wall consistently.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I definitely, my sense is that they prioritize pitching. And I've kind of felt that like from the beginning. I just feel like that's, and, we'll get to, I want to talk about Imai and Dylan Cease and some of these other options. That's just, if I was a betting man, I would guess that they load up on that and maybe make, an incremental signing or two on offense. But I do agree with you. I think, I was, I think, one of the loudest in banging the drum for Kyle Tucker. It's tough to square, what you want to make of that second half with the injuries and stuff like that. But I do think that a lot of the fan base has, and now look, I don't expect them to match, even if they really wanted him. If the Dodgers are going to give him whatever they want to give him, the conversation's over, right? But I do think a lot of the fan base has kind of like written it off as though it's not a significant thing. And like the one thing that has really been sticking in my head, as I've been thinking about this the last few days, like even breaking it down to the first half. And that's probably not even the most extreme split, especially for Carson Kelly, but like Carson Kelly, Kyle Tucker in that first half, a 151 and a 145 WRC plus respectively. If you lose Tucker, you're not getting that. And Carson Kelly almost assuredly is not doing that again. And overall, his season ended up, in a normal spot for Carson Kelly. But I would expect next year it is not as extreme, maybe a little more level. But getting that extreme performance from him, I mean, he had what, a 1,500 OPS for the first month and a half of the season. Like, that's a big reason that they were able to go closer to 500 for, that majority of the second half. And they were still pretty comfortably a playoff team. And if not, like you said, for the Brewers going on that heater, they would have won the division. And it's not only because of those guys. And now Michael Busch had the best numbers in the first half. So like, you still have some of that returning, but I think there's maybe a little like underestimating going on of like how significant a loss is, especially a guy like Tucker, who even at his worst was still getting on base, 36% of the time. Like, that's not easy to do. And just throwing, I'm bullish on Ballesteros and Casey, and I want to see these guys. I hope Matt Shaw can be the Matt Shaw of the second half and not the first half. He had a better second half WRC plus than Alex Bregman, which is like one of the conversations that people have. But I do agree with you. It would be a very, very risky move and a disappointing one. I don't necessarily expect them to bring back Tucker or even replace him on an equal value. But I think to kind of just turn it over and say, hey, go get them, young guys, like we're just going to see what happens. That's leaving way too much potential risk because the floor of that group is relatively low. And again, I believe in a lot of these guys, but you're asking several young players that just don't have those consistent track records, or in some cases track records at all, to really step up and contribute. And then at that point, you better hope that Michael Busch doesn't take any step back, even if it still ended up being a great season, or Dansby Swanson or Nico Horner coming off a career year, stuff like that. So I do hope that they replenish, let's call it, this offense in some way, even if I largely expect they invest on pitching. And, with their defense, I don't think it's the worst strategy, but I don't think you can just set it and forget it with the offense as currently constructed if Kyle Tucker is not back.
Yeah. And I think a good thing to keep in mind for some who might be tempted to say, hey, we've got Owen Casey, we're okay, is look at how long it has taken for Pete Crow Armstrong to emerge. And I wouldn't even say fully into the player that he is, because we saw a very different PCA in the first half of the season compared to the second half of the season. And every player's trajectory is different. Player's, development path is different and all of that. But, you have a guy who came up at the tail end of 23 and didn't get a hit. And then, 24 very much looked like a rookie in his first full season. And then this year really gave us at least a few months of, holy cow, what do we have here? But then the struggles came in the second half, and you saw, the strikeouts creeping up and all that kind of stuff. So, you're just, again, you're asking a lot of a young player to come in and not only fill the role, but step into the shoes once occupied by Kyle Tucker. That's not realistic. So yeah, there needs to be an investment there of some kind to help bridge that gap a little bit. And then you're right, though. I do think that it sounds a whole lot like the focus is going to be on pitching. And it could just be because that's where the market is right now. And that's where, what players are accessible to them, given what their spending goals are and some of that kind of stuff. And so they just have to say, yeah, maybe we'd love to bring in some monster power bat to play outfield for us, but they're not available. And And so we've got to try to improve in a different way, which maybe pitching is the way to do it.
Yeah, and we're going to hit our second ad break here in a second, but you look at some of these names. Like I would love, a reunion with Schwarbs, or if they want to look at Pete Alonso, things like that. But again, I'm not happy if they're not spending money. Trust me. But I also understand from an organizational perspective if they said, look, we don't want to lock up too much money in a guy that we're going to stick at DH every game. And that's just not where we want to give out a 5 or 6 year contract. Like that's not what we want to do. And just finishing off on the offense too, like, thinking about, and it's not like they would be fielding a team of 6 rookies. But you look at a guy like Matt Shaw, like I would look back at the last year for Matt Shaw and call it really successful. When you looked at his development, his age, and just how it went, it was really tumultuous. And so depending on how many guys do you want to maybe be going on that journey with? I mean, Matt Shaw was sent down. He was bad on offense in the first half, but obviously turns it around. And for a 23-year-old, you're like, well, this is really successful. I think he went through a lot. He came out of it looking good on the other side, and we'll see how he kind of goes from there. But I think that's the risk with kind of just saying like give Casey playing time, give Ballesteros playing time, let Shaw continue and have third base be his job. Like that's several guys, like putting a lot of pressure on them and really not giving them too much of a soft landing. Like you'd be in a bit of trouble if their seasons were as up and down as Shaw's was in 25, even if you felt good about them at the end, and the end result. So we'll keep talking about this. We'll get back into pitching. Going to hit our second ad break here, and we will be back with you momentarily. Forget one day only. Black Friday is going on all month long at Ray Chevrolet in Fox Lake. Come in today to shop the Black Friday sales event and drive home with 10 to 30% off MSRP on new Chevrolet models, plus no payments for 120 days. Or check out their selection of over 125 vehicles priced under $20,000. With one of Chicagoland's largest Chevy inventories, you're sure to find the perfect vehicle for you. And as one of the top-selling Chevy dealers in the Midwest, they're able to keep their prices competitive, so you'll get a great deal. Plus, Ray's Price Promise lets you shop confidently because the price tag you see is the price you pay. Go see for yourself. Visit our partner at their convenient location right on Route 12 in Fox Lake. They've been serving the community since 1963. Together, let's drive.
So one of the things I miss about, the baseball season is the chance for, as much as I go to baseball games to cover the sport, I love also trying to take my kids to games. I love taking them to Wrigley. I even take them to the South Side to see games. And we have a blast. But one of the things that really frustrates me every time is trying to buy tickets, trying to get tickets. You're dealing with, sometimes I'm in a queue for tickets for certain games. You're going through all the login screens. Sometimes I think I'm getting a price for a ticket, and then that price jumps at checkout. All I want to do is just be there in the moment at the game, cheering on, the team with my sons. And that's part of what's so great about the Game Time app is it gives the advantage back to the fans. It's the hack for unlocking amazing tickets and experiences in a few taps. Game Time is incredibly easy to use, and the Game Time guarantee means you can trust you'll get 100% authentic tickets on time and at the best price. Plus, fees are always included, so what you see is what you pay. So I can't say too much because with Christmas time coming up, but one of the gifts that I'm shopping for my kids right now is I want to take them to a Blackhawks game. They've never seen the NHL in person. It's been years since I've gone to a game. So I'm going to use Game Time to look for some hockey tickets for my boys so we can go see a game here right after Christmas. And so going through the ticket deals on Game Time already, it's been so easy to find the tickets that I need at a really good price. And part of what I love about Game Time too is even if I wait until closer to the day of the game, I can still get those tickets fast and I can still get a good price. So the process of finding the seats that you want is very intuitive. It's very easy. Great seats in minutes. And so when you're looking at seats, I love the fact that you can customize your spot. You can look at, what the view from the seat's going to be like. It really makes the whole experience so much nicer. And in the Game Time app, you've got exclusive discounts like zone deals where you choose the section, the Game Time selects the seats, and you save. So all that means that I can make sure that I get a great experience for my kids and go see a Blackhawks game sometime later this winter. So with Game Time, the priority fees are included. So your total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. They have zone deals. You save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. You can snag new ticket deals before anyone finds out by following your favorite teams in the Game Time app to receive alerts. With the seat views, you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know what it's going to look like. And they have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And with Game Time ticket coverage, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code CHGO for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code CHGO for $20 off. Tap, ticket, go. Download the Game Time app today.
All right, folks, back with you. And we are talking Chicago Cubs and the offseason, and it is time for our Taking the Temp segment. We are going to take the temp on Tatsuya Imai, who is coming over from Japan. The Taking the Temp segment is brought to you by your trusted local experts at Four Seasons Heating, Air Conditioning, Plumbing, and Electric. Visit fourseasonsheatingcooling.com for all their special offers and money-saving coupons. That's fourseasonsheatingcooling.com. Jared, this is a name that is certainly out there, and one we have heard attached to the Cubs. I know Bruce Levine was, on the radio, I think, earlier on Thursday morning, suggesting that, he didn't, I'm not going to get it. He was pushing back on some of the notion that, the Cubs don't spend as much, which, again, there's some nuance there. I didn't quite agree with everything that Bruce was saying, but at least that if this was a splash they wanted to make, that he didn't see any reason they wouldn't put the money there. And, a little background, I'm sure if these rumors heat up, I'm sure Brendan will have graphs for us and a deeper breakdown than most of us can handle on Imai here. But some, back of the napkin stuff for you. 27 years old. He'll be 28 in May, just to kind of center his age when he was if he was starting with the Chicago Cubs next year. I read some scouting reports, generally sitting in the mid 90s, but has the ability to touch the upper 90s, really exceptional numbers over in the MPB. And of course, doesn't cost you any prospect capital. He will not cost you a qualifying offer. And it is certainly an area, while they are not the, pinnacle of guys coming over from Japan at this point in Major League Baseball. There's a pretty famous team who is kind of leading the charge there, so to speak. But the Cubs have had a lot of success with guys coming over from Japan, especially in recent years. We started the show by talking about Shota Imanaga, Seiya Suzuki, obviously one of the key contributors on this offense. So we know it is an area that they are investing in heavily. We know it is an area that they are comfortable in. And I will be curious, and maybe we can square this to kind of Dylan Cease as well as one of the popular names that's out there. Dylan Cease does have a qualifying offer, difference in age, but of course you're dealing with the unknown of a guy coming over from Japan and how his game translates. Reading some of the scouting reports, it sounds like Imai is a guy who really attacks the strike zone. And how that all translates, what the Cubs would do if they got him in the pitch lab with Tommy Hotovy, Sombro, these other guys, and if they tweaked anything. But I'm curious, Jared, like, obviously we're all kind of flying in the dark a little bit here, but I would expect you wouldn't be surprised if this was a direction the Cubs went and said, we're not going to give, $300-400 million to Kyle Tucker, but if, their right deal is there and it's 175 to Imai or something like that, whatever the made up contract terms are, I expect that wouldn't surprise you if that was something the Cubs prioritized.
Yeah, not at all. Because, like I said, before the break, I think sometimes you might have your picture in mind of what you'd like to be able to do in an ideal scenario, but sometimes you have to be responsive to what the market is offering. And so when you do have a pitcher like this, who's there, who's available, who's going to come over and pitch for somebody in the United States, and you have had, like you said, very, I think, positive returns on two players, coming over from Japan in just the last few years. I think that's definitely something they have to explore. I expect that they already are. And I do expect that the Cubs are going to make at least a very competitive offer. You are up against it a little bit, where I think oftentimes we've seen some of the players coming from Japan who prefer the West Coast in general. But then also that, for like any player, it's the Dodgers always looming there and their ability to just kind of take anybody. But I don't think, not for nothing, the Cubs have signed two significant Japanese free agents in the last 4 or 5 years, and have been in, discussion or a part of the conversation with many others. And so they have made themselves a desirable landing spot for some of these players, despite the fact that they're in a very different part of the country than, Los Angeles or Seattle or San Francisco and some of these other cities. So that, I think, is worth acknowledging. But you're right. I do fully expect we're going to see a competitive offer from the Cubs for him. I would love the signing if they do it, because of what the potential is. And I think given the success that they've had with Imanaga in the past couple of seasons, I think their odds are they'll be successful with translating what he was able to do in Japan over to here, and having him really hit the ground running as a part of that rotation. And a big part of why I am intrigued by the idea is, in the same way that I want a little more power in the lineup, I love the idea of a pitcher in your starting rotation that's going to give you 95, 96, and maybe a little bit more. I kind of want that big arm in the rotation too. And
it was nice.
Strike zone. Yeah.
Yeah, it was nice, even as Kate Horton was coming up and developing, like, okay, we're throwing a little gas here. Like, we're getting past everybody in the rotation sitting at, 91, 92 miles an hour. And, they've had guys that made it work, right? Like, we were talking before we came on about Kyle Hendricks retiring, and certainly there's examples of it working, but occasionally, outside of the guys just coming out of the bullpen, it is nice to throw a guy out there for 5 or 6 innings that's just pumping gas.
Yes.
I do think this is one to watch. Look, there are going to be some big markets involved. If the New York markets get involved, that's always been an attractive place for players coming from Japan or Korea. They have very strong relationships there. If the Dodgers decide that at this point, if the Dodgers decide they're interested in anyone, you have to sort of, unfortunately, just throw your hands up and say, well, okay, that's a bummer.
Right.
But I do think, the Cubs, they play in the Japan series last year. And, kind of, I don't know if it's even like conspiracy thinking in my head, but like, if we're always talking about feeling like this front office is being cheap and they're not spending at their revenue levels or anything like that, like, it seems the Dodgers and also, the Cubs probably have insight and are experiencing this themselves. Like, you're tapping into a whole different market. If you're able to generate ad revenue that way, and I know the Cubs have with Seiya and Shota, like there's part of me that thinks, like, is this something that like Jed can convince Tom and Crane, like, hey, like there's money to be made here. Like the Dodgers aren't losing money having Shohei Ohtani. They're making it hand over fist. Like,
Yeah.
now that's not to compare Imai to, Ohtani, of course, but it is a very different, like, I don't think you're able to look at Dylan Cease in a sense where you're like, hey, let's think about the marketability here. And, the potential not that he, wouldn't bring some of that, but it is a pretty different calculus, I think, especially, if, as the Dodgers have, you're able to pair, say, a Suzuki and Imai, and if you are playing games in Tokyo, which, they're not this year, but that's clearly a market that Major League Baseball is tapping into and hoping to grow that connection between Major League Baseball and Japan and the MPB. So I think it makes sense on a ton of levels. I definitely think this is something the Cubs explore. It does, it comes with the usual caveat that if it reaches a certain level, it is hard to expect the Cubs to be the team that wins out. I think that's really where it comes into, that I don't think the Cubs don't spend money. I don't think that's like an accurate portrayal of things. But I do think, if we're talking about Kyle Tucker, if we're talking about Schwarber, Pete Alonso, any of these guys, I do think until they prove otherwise, we have to operate that if conversations reach a certain level of bidding and threshold, it's not going to be the Cubs. That they just have not shown that they're going to be the team that puts that last offer on the table.
And that's something that, players know that too. And so for as desirable as a place to play as Wrigley Field is, and for all the positive things that players have to say about the Cubs organization, if your price point is above a certain level, you kind of know that the Cubs are out of that conversation. So, and until they act differently, that's just how they've operated for the last however many years. And so they've yet to give a real reason to expect that they won't continue to do that. And that's we could probably devote multiple episodes to just kind of getting into all that kind of stuff. So, but I want to go back though, Corey, to something you said about Imai, and that is, the marketability aspect, because there is something to that. I think that's not something that should be overlooked or dismissed, by the fan base, where, there is something to be said for like drawing that kind of attention. The Cubs have already had some of that with Imanaga and Suzuki. And I can tell you just from the firsthand experience of seeing how much like the Japanese media devotes attention to those players. And it's not without reason. Like their fans over there are so desirous of any information that they can get, any look at these guys that they can get. Because they take a lot of pride in what, when their guys come over here and are successful, rightfully, they take a lot of pride in that. And so, if you add another player to your organization with, Imanaga, who's been here and maybe will still be here, and Suzuki, who will be here at least for a little while longer, that kind of continues to build that relationship. And so you're broadening out a fan base that's already stretched across the United States and a lot of other parts of the world where that's not nothing. That does matter. So I like that as a possibility as well for that reason. And I think that's important. And that's sometimes where the Cubs have been good at giving a counterweight to, maybe we're not going to win a bidding war, but there are things about playing for the Cubs that you won't get in other organizations. Yeah,
100%. I mean, and, we hear players say that all the time. I'm sure you talk to them all the time about their experiences here. I know obviously I'm not reading quotes from relievers that are leaving the Arizona Diamondbacks. So maybe they say good things about teams everywhere, but I think we've, been, we've had the information over the last several years of guys coming over. And as you mentioned with Justin Turner, like this feels like a different clubhouse, like some of these relievers coming over, like, hey, they really treated me well. They changed, my career and like put me on a better path. And I feel better for having been in the organization. I'm sure some don't say that, but in general, we're not reading much of that. So
you don't, you're not really hearing a whole lot of that. And I think even cases where players who are no longer in the organization, who are still kind of making sort of a positive pitch for the Cubs, even though they have since moved on, there are many examples where that's happened. So, that's a testament to the quality of the organization as well. And I have talked to guys who about their former organizations in some cases, and not necessarily on the record all the time, but they do share things and they talk about their experiences with other teams, and they're not always, they're not shy about saying places that they played that it hasn't been a positive experience.
I think
there is a difference.
Well, and I think there's been a lot of stuff recently, like, it is one. I always say this about like bullpens when everybody's mad about the bullpen, like you got to watch other teams. Like you just think your team's bullpen is bad because you watch it every day, but you don't know what a bad bullpen looks like go watch this other team. Like go read some of those stories, like coming out of Anaheim about like what was going on there. And like, we're talking about whether teams enjoyed playing here and like they've grown as players, et cetera. We're reading articles coming out of Anaheim where they don't have an air conditioner in their gym. Like, I think sometimes you can't really fully appreciate like what might be going on in a different organization. But I do want to talk a little bit about Dylan Cease. I feel like we keep mentioning him, but we didn't really dive into it. So in these last 10 minutes here, like, I think, again, another area I expect the Cubs to be active in, but does also absolutely represent one where I would not be surprised if the ultimate bidding and price is one that they're not interested in. I know John Morosi was already talking about Houston being a very strong connection there. But yeah, look, we all knew Dylan Cease before he left the organization. We became extra familiar with him when he was doing things against the Cubs at Wrigley Field for the White Sox and the Padres. He's got great stuff, and he's an interesting guy to look at. The last several years, his FIP has been quite consistent, but the ERA quite inconsistent. So I'm sure some folks, will look at some of those raw numbers, 4.5 ERA last year. 4.58 with the White Sox in 23, but that FIP is always in a pretty nice area. So that's going to depend on how much you want to dig into those metrics, what you believe in, what you find to be the best kind of predictor of future performance. From a narrative perspective, it's a fun one. Obviously, getting a guy that, grew up in the Cubs system, but ultimately, never pitched here, part of a very big and I don't know, infamous trade, I guess, with the White Sox. So it's certainly fun in that regard to see him. If you were able to see him in a Cubs uniform pitching at Wrigley Field, everything sort of comes full circle. And he would add a lot to this rotation, as we talked about. So I am certainly interested in that. I think, again, for me, pitching is the direction I expect them to go. If they're not going to make a big splash on offense, even if it's, as I said, incremental adds, I think a lot of these names we talk about, I feel right now that the potential ceiling for this Cubs rotation is good. They have a lot of depth. And if you get to a point, even right now, where you have a healthy Justin Steele later in the season, Matthew Boyd coming back and even picking up a little bit where he left off for the Cubs in 25, Cade Horton coming back from his injury and, taking that next step in his career. Jameson Taillon coming back and doing more of what we've seen the last couple of years, even if in an inconsistent way. I think there's a lot of potential there. Assad coming back and being part of, et cetera, right?
Yeah, right.
But still a lot of questions there. And so if they're not going to make that big splash on offense, I think bringing in a guy like Cease or bringing in a guy like Imai or, as we talked about earlier, Valdez, just loading up on that pitching to the point that you feel like, all right, with our middle of the infield defense and Pete Crow Armstrong in center field, got some power pitchers in this rotation now. Like, this is how they're going to win games. And, you can win games that way in the MLB. Is it perfect? Is it my ideal offseason? No, but I think some of these names would be significant additions to this rotation. And I would like to see it. If they're not going to bring Kyle Tucker back, like, load up that rotation so that whoever's starting every fifth day, you feel really confident in your ability to win a ball game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good example of where, you have to kind of go with what's available and go with what your realistic options are. And if that's the path that you have to take to try to get better and through pitching, then go all in for it. And I say really go after it. There are a few reasons why I actually would love the Dylan Cease, back with the Cubs. And that's to say nothing for the whole narrative aspect, even though it's going to be a really cool story if it happens. But I like, number one, like we mentioned it earlier in the show, but durability. I think for this rotation, given its potential depth, I love the prospect of a pitcher who, knock on wood, fingers crossed, so far in his career has shown you, as Sean said, is going to give you 30 to 32 starts a season. And you kind of set it and forget it. You don't really have to worry about it. I love that, the prospect of that for the Cubs. And two, and Corey, you beat me to it, but like with Dylan Cease, you take the, ERA fluctuations over the last few seasons. And I think you can kind of throw that out the window, because you do look at those FIP numbers and imagine Dylan Cease pitching in front of the Cubs defense and the difference that is going to make for a pitcher like him. That's huge. Because if you go back and look at even like when Dylan Cease was still with the White Sox, he wasn't exactly pitching in front of, some of the best defenses in baseball. That team has taken big steps forward defensively, but since that's happened since he's been gone. So that's another reason why I really like the Dylan Cease, the prospect of Dylan Cease in that rotation. And then lastly, because if he's there, you're talking about a rotation where potentially the back end of your group is Jamison Taillon and Matt Boyd. If those are the last two guys in your rotation,
yeah,
you're better than anybody else in the league.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this skews based on position, but, looking at the Padres last year, like DRS closer to middle of the league. But again, it depends on position and who they're throwing out there. But the Cubs, obviously, are the top of the league in a lot of those defensive metrics. And yeah, as you and Sean said, at least 32 starts every single year since 2021. A pretty rare breed in that regard as it goes. And yeah, something that I do think the Cubs need, like to having that stability and a guy that you can count on to be out there. I do think that's worthwhile. Now, again, they'd have to see how they feel about the qualifying offer, but if Shota leaves and you get that pick, maybe you don't care about that. Lot to consider. But I think that wraps us up here. Last 2 minutes, obviously I assume he listens to the show, but shout out Kyle Hendricks. Good luck in your retirement. Hope you're I'm sure he's not going to be in the bleachers drinking beers like one Anthony Rizzo, but one of the most enjoyable pitchers of my entire life and the most unique pitchers of my entire life. And I think someone who taught me a lot about appreciating the craft of pitching. I've never spent more time looking at tunneling and changing eye levels than I did when watching Kyle Hendricks. So cheers to the professor, number 28, pitched some of the biggest games in Chicago Cubs history. Yes, Sean.
Sorry to interrupt. No, I just wanted to add, even though Cease has made all of those starts, when you do look at innings pitched since 2021, Valdez has more than him, 884 for Cease, 902.1 for Valdez. Valdez only made 28 starts in 2024, but Valdez does go deeper.
Yes.
I know he threw a ball at the heart of his catcher, but maybe that's a discount, A can of corn falls on the floor and, they mark that down. So
no, that is a fair thing. And I know, even going back to his prospect days, like Cease was always, somewhat of a command guy. Pitch count can get up there if he's a little wild. So yeah, these are all things to consider. And, I think it's an interesting discussion to square it with someone like Imai, where you have that unknown of him coming over. And, Cease, of course, carries his own question marks and things the Cubs would have to be digging into. But qualifying and offer decisions on Tuesday, winter meetings not long after that, as we get into the holiday season here and the offseason really picks up. So, Jared, as always, appreciate you filling in for Brendan here. You can catch all of Jared's excellent writing over at allchgo.com. Brendan and I will be back with you next Thursday. And as always, go Cubs.
We all silly like the mayor.